The envelope sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before anyone touched it. I knew what it was. The return address said Hargrove and Sutton, attorneys at law. My grandfather's firm had used them for decades. I recognized the logo before I even picked it up. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. My grandfather passed on a Tuesday in March, quietly, the way he did most things. He was 81 years old and had built a construction empire from a single truck and a loan he paid back in 14 months. He used to tell that story at every Thanksgiving. By the end, none of us needed him to finish it. We could mouth the last line along with him. 14 months and not a day late. He was proud of that. He should have been. I was 29 when he died. I hadn't spoken to most of my family in almost 2 years. That part matters. Keep it in mind. My brother is 4 years older than me. I'll call him what he is, the favorite. He was groomed for it, honestly. My grandfather's name, my grandfather's name, my grandfather's handshake, my grandfather's laugh. He wore it like a costume and nobody ever checked if it fit. My parents reinforced it. Sunday dinners, holidays, every family decision. He was consulted first. His opinion landed first. Mine landed somewhere near the floor. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because it's the architecture of everything that followed. I graduated from college with a finance degree and went to work for a regional accounting firm outside of Charlotte. I was good at my job, methodical, detail-oriented. My grandfather respected that about me. He told me so, privately. The kind of thing he'd never say in a room full of people. He called me twice a month. My brother didn't know about those calls. Neither did my parents. About 4 years ago, my grandfather started talking to me differently on those calls. Less about the business, more about what came after it. He was getting older. He knew it. He started asking me questions, practical things, estate planning things, the kind of questions that take a certain kind of mind to think through clearly. I answered honestly. I told him what I knew and admitted what I didn't. He appreciated that too. "Your brother wants the whole thing," he said to me once, late on a Thursday evening. He said it the way you say something that isn't quite a complaint but isn't quite an observation either. Just a fact sitting in the air. I told him that didn't surprise me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want?" I thought about it. "I want things to be fair," I said. "That's all I've ever wanted." He didn't say anything after that, but I heard something in the silence that felt like agreement. The falling out with my family didn't happen over one thing. It never does. It was a series of smaller things that accumulated until one of them finally broke me. The clearest one was my father's birthday dinner, 2 years before my grandfather died. My brother showed up 40 minutes late, announced he'd just closed a deal on a new warehouse property. A deal I had helped him structure, by the way. 3 months of weekends I'll never get back. And accepted the applause of the table like he'd climbed Everest solo. My name was not mentioned. When I tried to bring it up quietly afterward, my mother told me I was being petty. "He always does this," I said. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said. "You don't understand the weight he carries." I understood perfectly. I had been carrying half of it without acknowledgement for years. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking garage for almost 20 minutes before I could go inside. I wasn't crying. I was trying to figure out when exactly I had agreed to be invisible. I hadn't agreed. I'd just been worn down into it. I stopped attending family functions after that. My grandfather understood. I told him honestly and he listened without judgment. My parents called it immature. My brother probably didn't notice for a while. That somehow was the worst part. My grandfather died on a Tuesday. The funeral was the first time I'd been in a room with my family in almost 2 years. I sat in the third row. My parents and my brother sat in the first. My mother cried with the practiced grief of someone who had already decided how they wanted to appear. My brother stared straight ahead with an expression I couldn't read. My grandfather's business partner, a man in his 70s named Gerald, who had known my grandfather since they were both young and stubborn, sat 2 seats from me and reached over once to pat my hand without saying anything. That small gesture undid me more than anything else that day. We buried my grandfather on a hillside in Cabarrus County. He had picked the spot himself. Of course he had. The reading of the will was scheduled for 10 days later. I drove up from Charlotte the night before and stayed in a hotel. I didn't tell anyone I was in town. The morning of the reading, I wore a navy blazer and flat shoes, practical. I arrived at Hargrove and Sutton's office on the fourth floor of a glass building downtown at exactly 9:50. My parents were already there. My brother was already there. My brother looked at me the way people look at a piece of furniture they'd forgotten they owned. The attorney's name was Mr. Sutton. The son, not the founder. He was maybe 55, careful with his words. The kind of man who had delivered difficult news often enough that his face had learned not to telegraph what was coming. He offered coffee. My mother accepted. I didn't. My brother checked his watch. Mr. Sutton opened a folder. He read through the preamble the way attorneys do, measured, deliberate, stripping out any drama. My grandfather had left specific bequests to his longtime employees, a sum to his church, a scholarship at his alma mater in his name. Then Mr. Sutton looked up. The remainder of the estate, he said, including all ownership interest in Whitmore Construction Holdings, all associated real property, and all liquid assets held under the family trust, valued at the time of this document's execution at approximately $47 million, my mother made a sound, is to be divided as follows. 60% to his grandson. He said my brother's name. My brother's jaw tightened slightly, not relief, more like the confirmation of something he'd expected as his birthright. And 40% to his granddaughter. He said my name. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then my brother stood up. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened next, because I've replayed it so many times that the edges have gotten strange. But the facts are the facts. My brother picked up the copy of the trust document that had been placed in front of him, a thick packet of papers held together with a binder clip, and he dropped it on the table. Not slammed. Dropped. Deliberately, like he was making a statement with the weight of it. This isn't right, he said. Mr. Sutton looked at him with the patience of a man who had seen this before. The document reflects your grandfather's wishes as if he was not in his right mind, my brother said. He hadn't been for a year. We all know that. That was a lie. My grandfather had been sharper in his final year than most people are at 50. I had spoken to him 3 weeks before he died. He'd corrected a calculation I'd made in my head faster than I could catch my own mistake. My mother said nothing. She was looking at the table. She hasn't been part of this family, my brother said. And now he was looking at me. Not with anger exactly. With something colder. She walked away. She doesn't deserve. The document, Mr. Sutton said, quietly firm, reflects your grandfather's wishes. My brother looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the copy of the trust summary. The single-page overview, not the full document, and he tore it in half. Clean down the middle. He set the 2 halves on the table, looked at me, and said, "That's what his wishes are worth." I looked at him. I felt something cold and very clear move through me. Like ice water, but not painful. Clarifying. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Here's what my brother didn't know. Here's what my parents didn't know. Here's what nobody in that room knew except for me and Mr. Sutton. 8 months before my grandfather died, he had called me on a Thursday evening, same as always. And he'd said something different. He'd said, "I need you to come up this weekend. Don't tell anyone." I drove up on a Saturday morning. He met me at the door himself, which he rarely did anymore. He walked me into his study and sat across from me at his desk, the same desk he'd had since before my father was born, and he opened a drawer and put a folder on the surface between us. "I've been doing some research," he said. The folder contained documentation, transactions, transfers made from the family trust over the prior 18 months that hadn't been disclosed to him. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Funds moved through an LLC my brother had set up 3 years prior. Using my grandfather's signature on documents my grandfather had no memory of signing. He wasn't confused when he said that. His hands were still. His eyes were clear. He was furious in the specific way that very controlled people are furious. Quietly and completely. "How long have you known?" I asked. 6 months, he said. "I've been building the record." He had hired a forensic accountant through Mr. Sutton's office, privately, outside of any family knowledge. The accountant had been working through the records for 4 months. The total figure was somewhere north of $2 million. "I want you to understand something," my grandfather said. He looked at me across that old desk, and he looked like himself, not like the diminished version my family would later try to claim in legal proceedings. He looked like the man who had paid back a loan in 14 months and told that story every Thanksgiving. "I am not changing my love for your brother, but I am not leaving this unaddressed." He told me he was amending the trust. He told me he was amending the trust. He told me he was adding protections. He told me that Mr. Sutton had already filed the updated documents with the county, not just the trust amendments but a declaration of competency signed by his physician and 2 witnesses dated 2 weeks prior, anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. He told me, if anything happens and they try to say I wasn't capable, the record is already there. I sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. He looked at me with something that I think was relief. "Because you're the only one who'll know what to do with it," he said. "And because you're the one who told me you just wanted things to be fair." I drove back to Charlotte that Saturday evening. I didn't tell anyone. I kept the folder. I put it in my fireproof safe at home, and I went back to my life, and every time my mother called to lecture me about being distant from the family, I answered politely and said nothing. The day after the will reading, my brother filed a petition to contest the trust. His argument was what he'd said in the room: cognitive decline, undue influence, the implication being that someone had manipulated my grandfather in his final years. He didn't name me explicitly in the initial filing, but the structure of it made clear enough who the implied manipulator was. My parents supported the petition. My mother sent me a text that evening, not a call, a text, that said, "You know this isn't right, he would have wanted things to stay in the family." I read it twice. I thought about everything that phrase had meant over the years. Stay in the family. As long as the family meant the version of it that didn't include me. I didn't respond. I called Mr. Sutton instead. What happened over the next 4 months is, in legal terms, fairly straightforward. In human terms, it was exhausting in a way that sits in your chest. My brother's attorneys subpoenaed financial records. Our attorneys had already prepared for that. The forensic accountant's report, completed before my grandfather's death, filed with the court as part of the trust's protective documentation, laid out every transaction, dates, amounts, the LLC structure, the signature discrepancies flagged by a handwriting expert who had also been engaged quietly months before any of this became a courtroom matter. My grandfather had been thorough. He had always been thorough. That was the thing about him that people who dismissed him as an old man with sentimental ideas had consistently failed to understand. He was meticulous, and he was patient, and he had seen people try to take things from him before. The opposing attorneys tried to argue the forensic report was biased, commissioned, they said, under undue pressure from the estate's beneficiary. The problem with that argument was the timeline. The accountant had been hired before I ever sat down in that study, before my grandfather had even told me what he'd found. The engagement letter was dated 4 months earlier than our conversation. My brother's attorneys pivoted. They tried the cognitive decline argument more aggressively. They submitted a declaration from a physician who had seen my grandfather twice in his final year. Our attorneys submitted the declaration from his primary physician of 11 years, who had seen him monthly, plus the competency evaluation, plus the signed attestation from 2 witnesses who had been present when the trust amendments were executed. The judge reviewed everything in chambers. This was in late September, about 6 months after the funeral. The hearing was on a Wednesday morning. I sat in the gallery. My brother sat at the plaintiff's table and did not look at me. My parents sat 2 rows in front of me and also did not look at me, but my mother's shoulders were rigid in a way that told me she knew exactly where I was. The judge was a woman in her early 60s. No nonsense in the specific way of people who have listened to many people waste her time. She had read the briefs, you could tell. She didn't need the summary arguments to catch up. She was already there. She denied the petition. Not with equivocation. Not with, "The court finds insufficient evidence at this time," phrasing that leaves a door open. She denied it, and she addressed, specifically, the claim of cognitive decline. and she noted that the documentation on the other side was, in her words, substantially and credibly supported. She noted the timeline of the forensic investigation. She noted the competency declaration. She noted that the trust documents had been properly executed and filed and that no credible evidence had been presented to suggest otherwise. She also flagged the financial discrepancies identified in the forensic report and referred the matter to the district attorney's office. That last part was not something I had asked for. That was the record doing what records do when they're thorough enough. My brother left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. His attorneys spoke quietly in the hallway. My parents followed him out and I watched the back of my mother's head disappear through the double doors. I sat in the gallery for a few minutes after the room had mostly cleared. Mr. Sutton came over and sat beside me. "Your grandfather anticipated most of this," he said. "I know," I said. "He was a careful man. He paid back a loan in 14 months, I said. "Not a day late." Mr. Sutton smiled. "It was small and it was real. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think people expect a specific thing and I'm not sure it's accurate. They expect triumph, relief, at minimum, the satisfying click of justice landing where it was supposed to land. I felt something quieter than that. I felt tired. I felt the specific weight of years of being the one who was asked to be smaller, to want less, to understand that the family's comfort required my invisibility. I felt the absence of my grandfather in a way that had nothing to do with money. The twice-monthly phone calls, the way he corrected my mental math faster than I could, the Thanksgiving story I could mouth along with him. I also felt, underneath all of it, something solid, something that had maybe always been there but had spent a long time getting obscured. I knew what I was worth. I had always known. I'd just been standing in rooms that kept telling me otherwise. The financial resolution took another 2 months to finalize. 40% of the estate, after legal fees and administrative costs, somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 million, was transferred into accounts in my name. The construction company retained its management team and continued operating. My brother retained his 60% share. Those subsequent proceedings related to the DA referral are ongoing, and I'll leave that where it is. I moved back to Charlotte. I went back to work. I had a long conversation with my therapist about what it means to win something you should never have had to fight for in the first place. My parents have not contacted me since the hearing. I think they believed, right up until the moment the judge read her decision, that I would blink, that something in me would capitulate, that I would be the smaller version of myself they were accustomed to. I don't fault them for misunderstanding. They had a lot of evidence on their side. I had spent years giving it to them. But evidence can be updated. Records can be corrected. That's the thing my grandfather understood, and that he spent the last year of his life making sure I understood too. A few weeks after everything concluded, I drove out to the cemetery in Cabarrus County on a Sunday afternoon. It was overcast. The kind of gray sky that can't decide if it's going to rain. I parked on the gravel road and walked up the hill. I stood at his grave for a while without saying anything. The stone was simple. Just his name, the years, and a line he had chosen himself. I won't put it here because it was his, and it was private, and some things should stay that way. But I will tell you this, standing there, I thought about the study, the old desk, the folder, the way he'd looked at me across all that mahogany and said, "You're the only one who'll know what to do with it." He hadn't been asking me to fight. He'd been trusting me to be ready. I had been ready. I hadn't known it then, but I had. All those years of being overlooked had done one thing nobody anticipated. They had made me pay very close attention to details, to discrepancies, to the things that didn't add up. Turns out that's a useful thing to be when it matters. I didn't cry at the grave. I had done most of my grieving in smaller, private moments. What I felt standing there was something more like gratitude. For the phone calls, for the trust, for the story about the loan he told every Thanksgiving. 14 months. Not a day late. I walked back down the hill to my car as the first drops of rain started to fall, and I drove home, and I made coffee, and I sat by the window for a long time watching the rain come down on Charlotte. The silence was mine, and for the first time in a long time, that felt exactly right. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, not the legal part. That resolved the way it resolved, and the record speaks for itself. I mean the part before all of it, the years of it. There's something I've come to understand that I couldn't have put into words when I was 23 or even 26, still trying to shrink myself into a shape my family found acceptable. Actions compound. Not the way interest compounds in a bank account. Cleaner than that, more honest. The way you treat people over time leaves a residue. Not in some abstract cosmic sense, but in the most practical human sense possible. The people you dismiss remember being dismissed. The people you overlook are paying attention to exactly what you're doing to them. My brother spent years taking credit he didn't earn, moving money he didn't have the right to move, standing in rooms and accepting praise for work that had other people's fingerprints all over it. And every time he did that, he assumed the people around him either didn't notice or didn't matter enough to do anything about it. That assumption was the real thing he destroyed when he tore those papers in half, not the document. His own position. My grandfather understood something I'm still learning to fully trust, that integrity isn't a feeling, it's a practice. He didn't respond to what he discovered by getting emotional or making threats. He built a record. He hired the right people. He filed the right documents. He called me on a Thursday evening and asked me what I wanted, and when I told him I just wanted things to be fair, he took that seriously in the most literal way possible. He engineered fairness on paper, in advance, with witnesses and signatures and a timeline no one could dispute. That's intelligence in service of ethics. That's what it actually looks like when someone with integrity responds to a wrong. I used to think that being overlooked was just something that happened to me, a condition of being the quieter one, the less assertive one, the one who drove home from her father's birthday dinner and sat in a parking garage trying to figure out when she'd agreed to be invisible. I thought it was a personality deficit. I've since figured out it wasn't. It was information. All those years of watching how things actually worked, who actually did the labor, where the money actually went, what was said in rooms versus what was true, that accumulated into something useful. Precision. The ability to see a discrepancy and know exactly what it meant. That's not nothing. That's actually everything, when the moment comes that requires it. I don't carry anger about any of it anymore. That surprised me when I first noticed it. I thought I would. But anger requires a kind of ongoing investment in the injustice. And I found I'd rather invest elsewhere. In the work. In the life I'm building. In the occasional Sunday drive to a cemetery in Cabarrus County where a careful, patient man is buried. A man who paid back a loan in 14 months and never forgot what it felt like to earn something on his own terms. He trusted me with the truth because he believed I'd know what to do with it. I'd like to think I proved him right. Not by winning, though I did, but by handling it the way he would have. Quietly. Thoroughly, without flinching. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The people who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. That's their failure of perception, not evidence of your limitation. Stay precise. Stay patient. Build your record. The truth doesn't need to be loud to be permanent.